In this topic, we'll be talking about the composition of the blood, what it's made of. So the blood has kind of two divisions, which we'll get into here. One division is this liquid portion of the blood called plasma. That, as you can see, consists of a lot of different things. Most of it is water. And then there's what are called the formed elements. They're kind of like cells or cell-like parts of the blood. We have white blood cells, red blood cells, and these things called platelets. Let's talk more about these. If we look at the blood, a little bit over half of it is this plasma. Again, think of this as the liquid portion of the blood. The vast majority, approximately 90% of your blood plasma is water. So over half the blood is plasma, and the majority of that plasma is just water. However, there are significant other things that are there, a variety of proteins that play in very crucial roles in our proper body functioning, which if you go on to an anatomy class, you'll learn more about. Salts, we talked before about electrolytes, how they're very important for proper functioning of electrical signaling and muscle function and more. And also a variety of substances we talked about and introduced earlier. Nutrients, wastes, hormones, etc. And then the other part of the blood, a little bit less than half, are what are called the formed elements. Like I said, these are three things: red blood cells, white blood cells, and things called platelets. The names in parentheses you will not need to know for this class, but if you go on to anatomy, it's possible that those terms would be what you'd want to know. We'll talk about each of those one at a time as well. So let's start here with platelets. Platelets are very small. They're actually fragments of cells, not actually true cells. Here is a picture of a platelet. And they're important for blood clotting. We'll get into how that works a little bit later. White blood cells are involved in protecting our body. So when bacteria or viruses get inside, the white blood cells, shown as this round thing up here, they help to defend us. And lastly, red blood cells. Red blood cells are the ones that transport oxygen around the body, and that's shown here. So where do these formed elements come from? The red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Well, they all start out inside our bones, actually. Inside our bones, we have bone marrow, this kind of fatty, spongy tissue. And they start out as stem cells. Well, what are stem cells? Stem cells are what we call undifferentiated cells. Sounds like a complicated word. Un means not, different. Not different. So they're cells that are kind of like these precursor cells that haven't yet chosen a path. They haven't chosen a career, and they can become any type of cell. Scientists have been able to figure out how to reprogram cells to become stem cells again. Or they can take stem cells and program them to become specific types of cells. And so at various locations in our body, even as adults, we have these stem cells, including in our bone marrow. So that's where all these are being formed. They leave the bone because the bone is not completely solid. There are passageways, blood vessels leaving the bone, and then they come out and they do their things. Last thing I'll mention about stem cells, which we'll probably talk more about in a future topic, is that we all started out as a stem cell, a single stem cell. Sperm and egg came together, formed the first cell that divided into a ball of identical stem cells, and then those started to turn on different genes, which we'll talk about later, to become the different cells in our body. So, as I mentioned before, red blood cells are involved in transporting oxygen. That's their main role. To a lesser degree, they also transport carbon dioxide, but carrying oxygen is their main role. Out of all of the formed elements, these are the most common by far. And their structure is very important. We'll talk later about how if their structure changes, it can cause major problems. But I like to think of them as a donut. And for me, whenever I look for donuts, I look for ones where there's like a hole in the center, like all donuts have, but it's actually got a layer of frosting covering that hole. See a little bonus frosting that way. And that's what I think about with a red blood cell. It's this kind of a donut with a little bonus frosting in the center, or like an inner tube, a raft, and that has a bottom covering. And so they're very smooth, they're round, they're flexible, so they can fit through very, very narrow blood vessels. Here's a view of a capillary, the narrowest of our blood vessels, so narrow that only a single red blood cell at a time can pass through here. And so they're very flexible. Each red blood cell can transport up to 1 million molecules of oxygen in it. An amazing amount of oxygen is being carried, and we're using a lot of oxygen around the body. So how is it that red blood cells can carry this oxygen? Well, first of all, they need to have this protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is called that because it contains iron. It contains 4 iron atoms in it, and it's actually those iron atoms that are able to bind or attach to the oxygen molecules. It's also those iron atoms that give blood its red color. Think about rust. When you see rusty metal outside, that's because it's iron. There's iron in there. When iron comes in contact with oxygen, it oxidizes and rusts. And so what happens is if you have hemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen on it, that oxygen is going to tend to bind to that hemoglobin, and it travels to a spot around the body where now there's low oxygen levels, and it's going to release that oxygen into respiring tissues. Those are tissues that are performing cell respiration and releasing that oxygen around the body, and then that hemoglobin can be used over and over again to reload oxygen and release it. One last thing to mention about this is it's sort of a side note, but I think it's interesting that there's a misconception that human blood is blue in veins and red in arteries. That's completely false. It's actually red in all of our blood vessels. It can look blue through the skin because of the way that the light is absorbed and different colors pass through, but it's actually red always. It's very bright red in arteries where it has lots of oxygen, most arteries, and it's very dark red, almost purplish in veins where there's low oxygen. You've probably heard about this condition called anemia, or being anemic. This condition is caused by having a deficiency of either enough normal, healthy red blood cells or not having enough hemoglobin inside of them. Without this, you feel tired and run down. Well, why is that? Why do you feel tired? Well, think about it. Red blood cells transport oxygen. Oxygen is needed for cellular respiration. And cellular respiration generates ATP, energy, that can be used for our cells to do work. So if you have less red blood cells, less oxygen, you have less ATP, you're going to feel tired. Another byproduct of cellular respiration is heat. So individuals who are anemic also are often cold because there's less heat generated, again, due to less cellular respiration. So these things are all connected, back to the beginning of the course. So what are some causes of anemia? Well, there are over a dozen causes. We'll talk about 3 relatively common causes, or 3 of the most common. One of them is just not getting enough iron in your diet. A poor diet where you're deficient in iron, because iron is that key component of hemoglobin. And iron you can get not just from meats and animal products, but also you can see here nuts, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, mushrooms, dark chocolate even has some iron in it. You probably wouldn't want to exclusively eat chocolate for your iron source, but in moderation, it's not necessarily bad for you. Another thing is blood loss. Massive blood loss can lead to anemia. And then something called sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease we'll explore in more detail when we get into the genetics topic, but remember how I'd mentioned that red blood cells have this kind of donut-like shape? Well, in sickle cell disease, that shape changes, and these cells become very rigid and inflexible, and they tend to get stuck. And that can lead to areas getting blocked, not receiving enough oxygen in the body. There are other problems that are associated with sickle cell disease as well. What I'll ask you to do now is to pause the video, read the question, and see if you can recall the answer. Okay, hopefully you've paused the video and come up with the answer now. Let's take a look at what makes up the largest portion of the blood by volume. That is the plasma. Hopefully you got that correct. If not, make sure you're paying close attention here. That's approximately 55%. Formed elements is approximately 45%. You do not need to know the exact numbers, but you should know that plasma is the majority of the blood. And these two things are part of the formed elements, so they definitely could not be the majority of the blood. See if you can recall, what's the third part of the formed elements? Red blood cells, white blood cells, and if you said platelets, that's exactly right. Those are the three things that are making up the formed elements. So moving from red blood cells into the white blood cells. For now, when you hear white blood cells, just think immune system. These make up all the cells that help to protect our body from various pathogens, viruses, bacteria, etc. that can cause us harm. There are a whole range of types. In the next immune system topic, we will discuss these in a little bit of detail. And unlike the raft-shaped red blood cells that float through our blood vessels, these white blood cells are like tumbleweeds. They literally roll along the walls of the blood vessels. And if there's an infection, a little marker like a hand will be sticking out. And it'll catch on to the white blood cell. It'll change shape and it'll leave the blood vessel and go out to chase after bacteria. And I'll actually show you a video of that happening in the immune system topic, at least the chasing of bacteria part. And now platelets. Platelets are not cells, they are cell fragments. They're still in the formed elements, but they are not cells. They don't have any organelles. They're basically like little stamps of cytoplasm. And they help to form this temporary plug to slow down blood loss. You should know that these are the two most important components here that lead to a blood clot. Platelets plus fibrin, that leads to a blood clot. And we'll talk more about how this specifically occurs. That will prevent you from losing blood continuously. So let's say that an injury happens and one of your blood vessels gets cut. It might be a small one like a capillary, or it could be a deeper injury that injures a vein or an artery, which would be much more serious. The video I'm about to show you, you can also bring up on your phone if you put your camera on and you look down here and you bring it around this QR code. It should recognize that and allow you to open up this link. Let's take a minute here. We'll start at 4 minutes and 30 seconds for this video. Go ahead and get to that point.
Pretty replaceable. When it comes to your body, science has figured out how to balance the osmotic pressure. All right, bleeding. I want to talk about that. Because for the very reason that I mentioned at the beginning, that we can't replace your blood with some synthetic wonder fluid, the last thing that your circulatory system wants is for you to fritter away your blood in some sidewalk scrape or kitchen accident. So it has a whole system in place to prevent you from losing too much of it through a process known as hemostasis. So imagine you're slicing up a nice garlic cheese bagel one morning and you lacerate the distal phalanx of your pollex. In other words, you cut the tip of your thumb. And now you're bleeding all over your breakfast. At the very first sign of rupture, the blood vessel actually constricts itself to slow the flow of blood through it. Then little cell fragments called platelets gather at the site of the injury, creating a plug that dams the breach and keeps the blood from leaking further. Now, these free-floating platelets don't clump together during regular circulation. That would be terrible. But when the endothelial cells lining a blood vessel wall tear, the underlying collagen fibers are suddenly exposed, and they chemically react with the platelets, turning them all sticky and glue-like at the scene of the injury. But that platelet plug still isn't as strong as it could be. It needs reinforcement to complete the clotting process. This reinforcement comes in the form of fibrin threads, protein strands that join together to make a sort of mesh that traps the platelets and blood cells. Eventually, the threads actually pull the opposite sides of the wound together to close the vessel wall so the endothelial cells can be replaced. Over a few days, the blood vessel heals and the blood clot dissolves, or at least that's how it's supposed to happen. People who suffer from disorders related to hemostasis may have trouble with unwanted unwanted clotting or the inability to form clots. In the family of disorders known as hemophilia, a patient can usually...
All right, so we'll stop that video there. If you want to, you can read more about or listen to more about hemophilia and other things, but I wanted to focus specifically here on the clotting process itself. So just to restate, as the video had mentioned, the immediate response due to an injury is that the blood vessels in that area constrict. We call this vascular spasm. This is the very first step of the hemostasis, the blood clotting or response that's reducing blood loss, maintaining normal blood conditions. Stasis, steady state, hemo referring to heme, which is iron-containing substances in the blood. So it contracts, which narrows that blood vessel at that area and reduces blood loss. Next, these platelets form a temporary plug. They get activated, and they act as like stamps, literally sticking a whole bunch of them to the site. What happens as a few platelets are attracted to the site, they release more chemicals. And these chemicals that they release activate and attract more platelets, which release more chemicals, attracting more and more and more, forming this temporary platelet plug. But usually, the platelet plug is not strong enough to keep that wound from opening up again, and so it needs to be reinforced. That reinforcement happens with fibrin. So we're not going to go through the details here into how fibrin gets activated from its inactive form, which is fibrinogen. But anyway, it forms this mesh, like a net, that weaves around and holds in those platelets and other things that might get trapped there. Erythrocytes we didn't need to know. That was the red blood cells. That's their other name. And it produces this clot now. Then that helps to get healed up, and voila, you've prevented bleeding to death. So blood clots usually form as a protective mechanism to reduce blood loss, but sometimes they happen when they shouldn't. So they can't always be a good thing, or they aren't always a good thing, I should say. So you may or may not have heard of this condition called deep vein thrombosis, or DVT for short. Thrombosis means the formation of a blood clot. And this happens usually inside of a large vein in either your leg or your arm. And what happens, this clot forms abnormally inside the blood vessel when there's no injury. And it can lead to a blockage there. That's not the most severe thing. The most severe is if part of that breaks off. And part of that breaks off and travels to a different part of your body, like your brain, your lungs, your heart. It can lead to a stroke, heart attack. It's called a pulmonary embolism, where part of your lungs lose oxygen because of this broken off clot that then blocks it. These can lead to death. Very, very serious. And the tendency to get this condition increases with age. There's also a genetic component. Certain behaviors or things that happen to you during your life may have increased the chance of developing this. But just to keep an eye out for it. For you, if you have parents that are older. So if you get these symptoms, it's time to go to the doctor, just to be sure. So if you have swelling of the leg or calf, but only in one leg. If it's in both legs, most likely that's some other cause, like maybe you were in a plane or you weren't moving for a long time, you didn't elevate your legs, they can swell up. But if it only happens in one, there could be a clot in there that's leading to this swelling up of fluid. Pain in one leg that can get worse when you start to use it. That area becoming warm and red due to increased blood accumulation due to that blockage. So again, look for these, get quick medical attention just in case, because if an embolism occurs, it can cause you to die very quickly or have serious long-lasting effects.